Ready here.
Hello and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is the second part to our incredibly awesome two-part series, taking a critical analysis and a look at the claims involved with the Nativity of Jesus from a secular point of view. This is based largely on my book, with some paper in it. My book, The Nativity, A Critical Examination, with a foreword by David Fitzgerald and Aaron Adair's book, who is with me. Hello, Aaron. I'll give you a hello in a second properly. The Start of Bethlehem, a skeptical view, a critical view and a skeptical view. You can see the position we take and where we're coming from. And we started in the previous video looking at a lot of the historical claims. We took a little look at how you can interpret the events theologically, or at least what are the problems if we find the events to be ahistorical, i.e. not true. Then what do you hang your theology on? What's propping up your theological claims? And we got as far as the Star of Bethlehem, and that's Aaron's area of expertise, as well as the Gospels as a whole. But today we're going to continue that journey towards the end of the Nativity accounts, including looking at Herod and Herod's character, so on and so forth. But before we start, first of all, Aaron, welcome back. Thanks for coming and joining in again.
Thank you, and hello to everyone, and happy belated Eastern Orthodox Christmas Day.
This is true. Pick your Christmas. We also had last time some contributions, and he's back in the live actually, so that's fantastic. As Brain Damage Bob there. So Bob popped in and gave us the sort of a few Christian points of view in bones of contention he had with our claims. So that's really great to have him back. You're going to actually continue talking about, just for the opening part of this, about the Star of Bethlehem, but kind of linking it to a more modern context. Do you want to introduce what you want to have a few words about?
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that the fact it was Eastern Orthodox or even Russian Orthodox Christmas the other day, because what I want to talk about a little bit is old Soviet propaganda that we can actually find in more recently declassified FBI files. So
wow,
we got lots of things
doing
like
modern FBI and cool stuff, and the Nativity of 2,000 years ago. Sorry, I interrupted you, but that's cool.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we can find a way to also tie this in with your Ukraine war updates.
I'm sure we can. Yeah, we can gerrymander anything. I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So go for
it. Yes. Yeah. So let me go ahead and share a document. Now, this is something that has been revealed by the FBI. They have what they call their vault, various historical documents from famous cases that are now declassified, and among them is some documents here that were originally sent back in the late 60s to J. Edgar Hoover. For your British listeners, that name probably doesn't mean anything, but J. Edgar Hoover was effectively the founder of the FBI and its longest serving director, and also seen as kind of scary to other Washington insiders because everyone thought Hoover had a file on them of dirt. So this was a person with lots of information, and in particular, we have this letter and document that was sent to the desk of Hoover.
Can I just interrupt you to say that British people know Hoover? I mean, we know J. Edgar Hoover to some extent, if we're slightly knowledgeable, but we know Hoover is a word that we call vacuuming. So it's I don't know if you do that in America so much, but we call, if you're going to do the hoovering, because of the Electrolux Hoover. So I like the way that you said file full of dirt and Hoover. That was very clever language play. But anyway,
very rarely will Americans refer to vacuuming as hoovering. I've heard it maybe 2 or 3 times. But more often than not, if I hear Hoover, I'm thinking either the old FBI director or the president of the late 1920s, early 1930s. Yeah. But anyways, there was this letter. First, the person is clearly a bit nervous because they're trying to say happy birthday to Hoover in July, and he was actually a New Year's baby. So this person just is trying to find any reason to, make contact. as far as I can tell, Hoover may never have actually read this, but this person is excited and nervous and trying to send him information about UFOs. And in particular, what was sent was a copy of this small European journal related to UFO contact. And this journal is a bit interesting because it has some of the very few contacts between Western UFO proponents and Soviet. So if I get to the right page, let me just scroll.
And this does all link to the Nativity.
Yes.
This isn't just
Oh,
random,
yes.
by the way.
Oh, yeah. It's not quite random. So they're basically saying, hey, there's this groundbreaking thing here that we're now able to communicate with a Soviet scientist about explanations of historic UFOs. And in this article, which was in a couple of different journals, but this is the one that went into the FBI vault and was later cited by other people working for the CIA as legitimate research. This scientist by the name of Vyacheslav Zaitsev talks about sources of contact between humans and aliens in great antiquity, as you can find in old stories and artwork. So, for example, pieces of artwork from the medieval period where things that look like spaceships. And if this is starting to look a little bit familiar from the History Channel, that's because this is where the shit from the History Channel comes from. And I'm calling it unkind words because it doesn't deserve kind words. But among the things that are in this article of alleged contacts between humans and aliens was the Star of Bethlehem story. This apparently, from what we can tell, that in the late 60s, it started becoming Soviet doctrine that the religions of the past were actually inspired by or caused by extraterrestrials. And in particular, the explanation for the Star of Bethlehem was that it was indeed a UFO. And John of Patmos had basically visitations from aliens, and that's why he had all these weird visions, things like that. And this was actually just a whole bunch of ultimately Western facing Soviet propaganda to try to undermine Western religion. So, quite literally, if you watch the History Channel, you are basically watching warmed over Soviet anti religious propaganda, but turned into esoteric Western stuff. But the interesting thing is, there's all this stuff here trying to talk about, possible conjunctions or other things the star could have been, but basically say, oh no, it can't be that because of its unusual motions. Clearly, it was a ship from the stars. And this sort of rationalization was being used by the Soviets to try to say, see, you guys are just a bunch of, silly poo-poo heads. You don't have the right dialectic materialism, and you are worshiping aliens while we are worshiping Karl Marx. But on the other hand, I've actually found that there were already Westerners, Americans, and French people who already were doing this switch beforehand because everyone could see basically, hey, this miracle star is, well, miraculous. You can stop sharing my screen if you'd like.
Well, I don't know if this is where you're going to go, but there was a really interesting move as we moved into the high criticism of the Germans and so on,
Yeah.
from the 17th Enlightenment period onwards, where you had this kind of idea that everything must be explained naturalistically.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had a lot of skepticism of the miraculous claims of the Bible, and then people sitting down and say, okay, well, if this happened, how can we explain that, how it happened? And then so you started getting, a predilection for these kinds of alternative viewpoints. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Yeah. Because the reaction was, hey, you could either take what you see in the stories and say it's miraculous, it couldn't have happened, or you could say it just looked miraculous, but we enlightened people know what really happened.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, it looks like a miraculous moving star. Well, maybe they're just using poetic language to discuss planetary motions. Or you could still say, well, we're going to take it literally. It was aliens.
Yeah. So previously in the last episode, we talked about how, and we only briefly touched on this, we didn't say exactly how it couldn't have been in conjunction, so on and so forth. But we all agreed, even the Christian we had on, Bob, who's in live there, we agreed that actually naturalistic explanations of the Star of Bethlehem don't do justice to the data and don't make much sense in terms of the behavior of the star, etc., etc. However, what is the ancient aliens theory? How would that work?
Yeah, the Ancient Aliens one is that literally the star was a flying saucer, and because it could then, look shiny, fly around in any direction, hover over particular locations, if need be, become a giant laser pointer for the destination for the wise men. Um, Given sufficient technology, you could mimic the motions of the Bethlehem star as described even by the hardcore literalist. But now, of course, you have the problem that you have to propose that aliens exist, they can come here, and what they like to do is travel trillions of miles to mess with Palestinians.
And it's the same kind of weird idea that and we talked about this in our book, Aliens and Religion, that will be forthcoming this year. But how the idea that people claim to be abducted and that aliens would use extraordinarily huge amounts of energy to go across the universe, great time and effort to then come to the other side of the universe and extract a human being, wonder what things look like in the human being's posterior, and shove a probe up there, and then or take a bite out of a cow and then leave. It's like that's clearly not what's going to happen. But so the idea that they come around, do some funky flying about, but how does it fit in with the theology? How do the theories fit in with like the birth of Jesus?
Mm. Well, I kind of think what at least the Soviets were doing were a bit tongue in cheek, that I don't think they were following it so seriously. It was just basically out there to undermine confidence in religion, both within the
Right.
Soviet Union where it existed, but especially outside, because most of the outfits that talked about that were Western facing and French or English language. But it's also part of general Soviet propaganda techniques. The most successful version of this was actually in the 1980s, which was called darn, the name of the project now escapes my mind. But basically, the Soviets started pushing the idea that the AIDS virus was actually created by the U.S. government to try to kill off African Americans.
Mm.
And they first started pushing that and publishing that in English speaking newspapers in India, and then allowed other Western outlets to see that news article and then spread it around the rest, until even today that lots of people actually still believe that, even though it was literally created cynically by the Soviets to just try to like antagonize race relations, especially in the United States. So
And
to me, this is a bit of a cynical thing, but other people who, like on the History Channel, are, at least in my mind, more true believers and really think aliens visited us and did all sorts of things around the birth of Jesus. Uh, they can be a little bit incautious about who Jesus is, because sometimes you'll actually find in the literature that Jesus is an alien. And other times, no, Jesus really is the Son of God, and the aliens knew that too, and they're just trying to get the message across to everyone else. It's a little bit unclear where they want to go with that, and it probably depends on how Christian the authors themselves are, or just how new agey they are, and how much you really want to believe in alien human hybrids.
And it is interesting that even Chris de Burgh, with his song "A Spaceman Came Traveling," which is a Christmas hit. I don't know if that's big in America, but it's a big Christmas hit in the UK. One of the ones you hear on radio, and it tells the story of a spaceman came traveling, and the ship is the lights and everything. So actually, that's a
Yeah.
really interesting Christmas song. But there you go.
Yeah, I remember reading a little bit about the creation of that song, and apparently, the artist who came up with it was literally reading Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, and that was inspiring him to come up with the song. Even though in Chariots of the Gods, Jesus is never called to be an alien, but apparently in earlier drafts of the book, he did go full Jesus is an alien.
Yeah. So that's Eric van Daniken, and then there's
Yeah.
von Daniken, isn't it? And then I remember reading Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock and being all into
Yeah.
that when I was a younger, more believable, more gullible person. But there you go.
Well, unfortunately, Hancock is still going strong because he just came out with a pretty successful Netflix series.
Oh dear.
I'm
Oh
sorry.
dear. And but it's the old Brandolini's law again, the law of bullshit asymmetry, where it
Mhm.
takes so much longer to unpick the nonsense than it does to claim it. But there you go.
Mhm.
So just that. So is that does that finish the kind of like looking at? I mean, the idea is that this is kind of nonsense and no one really believes that. They're truly skeptical. I mean, this is conspiracy theory and disinformation from the Soviets, which they're pretty
Mhm.
good at flooding the information space and seeing what sticks. Throw everything at the wall, and if something sticks, then happy days. Is there anything more to say about that?
Yeah, there's the American version of this too.
Okay, do it.
So, one of the things that I've been researching in my continuing research about the history of interpretations of the Bethlehem Star is the fact that, especially in the US, a certain phenomenon started growing in the early 20th century that if you went to an American planetarium during the holiday times, they would use that time to try to explain the Bethlehem Star, usually as a conjunction of planets.
Mm.
But the interesting thing is surveys of people who operate planetariums in the US and elsewhere, when you actually ask them, what theory do you think is best? The most common answer is it's all a bunch of BS. But
Mm.
they still promote it anyways because it puts butts in seats. It makes people feel comfortable. The audiences that come tend to be more religious than the average. It really is a case of Americans also happily pushing certain propaganda that they might ultimately believe is faulty or false, but see no real harm being done and think there's a greater good being done. In the same way, the Soviets, putting out just straight up lies to, promote the, greater cause of the communist revolution.
Which is an interesting thing. I mean, this happens quite a lot. You see it with things like the global flood of Noah's Ark, which is, instead of saying, right, this is utterly preposterously ridiculous, and therefore it's entirely supernatural, there is a very rich strain of Christian thought, which is, okay, let's try and find some kind of, in this case, geological, evidence for this, or some kind of scientific rationale for this thing taking place, and then we will appear to the skeptic and to the secular person far more persuasive, and it adds another element to their claims, and this would be similar with that.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and I'm just also seeing here in the chat, one of the chats from Para Andy, about his agreement about the quality of Hancock's research. Um, Two things. One, you don't need to censor the word crap, and two, a much stronger word is necessary here. And just to toot my own horn, I've actually gotten Graham Hancock personally angry at me and my work.
Brilliant.
He actually went after stuff that I had wrote in one of his more recent books, because I wrote this long blog article, and you had published it as well, about the construction of the temple at Baalbek in modern day Syria, or no, modern day Lebanon. I'm sorry. And that structure, Hancock is, really confident that it's super duper ancient, like 10,000 plus or whatever years old. But the actual like archaeology all indicates that it is basically from the Roman era, from like the imperial era. It might have even begun being started to be built by Herod the Great himself. And I had like summarized all the research and evidence that had shown that. And in one of his books, he was, trying to find any sort of way he can try to reinterpret the evidence that I had presented there to somehow still say it could still be over 10,000 years old or whatever. And it's just like, all right, I got under his skin without even talking to him directly.
Nice. So Andy, thanks for that. And as you can see, it's personal with Aaron. He can't criticize Hancock strongly enough. So thank you for that. As we go back to sort of summarize what we looked at last time, if you're cool with that at the moment, if you
Mm-hmm.
said. Yeah. So what we did last time is we looked at the fact that the nativity accounts, for those who didn't see the first one, are only appear in 2 of the 4 gospels. That's weird. They don't appear in the earliest gospel. That's weird. They don't appear in any of the writings of Paul, which is even earlier, some sort of 25 years maybe after the death of Jesus. That's weird. Paul doesn't mention any virgin birth, any kind of miraculous birth or anything of the sorts. So that's weird. No Bethlehem. Jesus is not known as Jesus of Bethlehem. He's known as Jesus of Nazareth. That's all kind of weird. So why would that be? And then you've got Matthew and Luke, whose 2 accounts diverge completely and utterly. So these appear to be not just divergent, but outright contradictory. And we talked about how they use different techniques to get Jesus to Bethlehem from Nazareth. Matthew has him already living in Bethlehem, it seems, and then traveling to Egypt after being chased out of the country for a couple of years because Herod tries to kill them. We're going to talk about that tonight. And then after a couple of years, go back to Nazareth, where it's safer up there, and that's how they get Jesus in Nazareth. Luke has a completely different plan. He has them living in Nazareth and then going down to Bethlehem because they need to go there for a census. We looked at how that doesn't make any sense. There's absolutely no precedent for that in Roman antiquity at all, in Roman history. And so people also Christians try and get around an added problem that there is a 10 to 12 year gap between the two stories necessarily, because Matthew talks about Herod. Luke doesn't mention Herod whatsoever. Luke doesn't mention the slaughter of the innocents, the Star of Bethlehem, the wise men. It doesn't appear in Luke at all. They only appear in Matthew. And having the king of the country chase you and your family out of the country because they're trying to kill you is a pretty important thing. Yet we don't hear about that in any of the other gospels, not in the nativity account of Luke. Like, why Luke would say, I'm going to write the story of Jesus' birth, right, and not mention the king of the country chasing the family out of the country for 2 years is insanely preposterous. So that seems to me rather bizarre. And we're going to talk about another outright contradiction between those two accounts just going forward in a second. And so we talked about how the census made no sense. There's no precedent for a census requiring people to go to their ancestral homes. It makes no sense to go to someone 41 times before in their ancestral line to go and get registered there. Everyone would be trying to go to the same place, so on and so forth. And we did a whole load of analysis on that. And what I didn't talk about, so I mentioned that Christians try and get around this by saying, well, the census of Quirinius, which is in 6 CE, somehow needs to be coherent and be simultaneous with Herod being alive. But we know that he died in 4 or 5 BCE, and we can pretty much guess he wouldn't have chased Jesus out of the country on his deathbed. So it probably would have happened like a year or two before that. So you got this perhaps 12-year gap. So they try and say that Quirinius ruled twice, except there's no evidence of that. Varus, we know, ruled at the time when Herod died. We've got the list of Roman governors, give or take, and we've got we've got Cassius Dio, and we've got Josephus, historians that testifying to this, and also we've got coinage that only has Varus rather than Varus and Quirinius. And then Christians say, well, there are these two stones, the lapis tibetinus and the lapis venetus, and they could, they try and get these inscriptions on the stone to argue that Quirinius was around at this time, and these are all very dodgy. I'll probably do a separate video on that rather than bog down this video with those claims, but they just don't stand up to scrutiny whatsoever. And there are loads of different ways that Christians try and harmonize these two accounts, but my opinion would be they completely and utterly fail. And that's kind of where we got to. Is that fair enough? Is there anything? Oh, and also the weirdness of the Magi following this star, kind of getting lost or whatever, or not, at least not following it all the time and going to Jerusalem, and then going, finding Herod, getting Herod involved in the story, going down to Bethlehem, and then when they're down in Bethlehem, because Herod said, "Come back to me, tell me where Jesus or the Messiah is born, and I'll go and worship him myself," sort of thing. But then they get warned by an angelic vision not to go back to Jerusalem, so they go back home a different way, right? And we talked about how that was really weird, because if God really didn't want Herod involved, because then Herod goes on to kill children in the area, because he doesn't know where Jesus is born exactly. He just kills all these children in the area. We're going to talk about that this session, but he goes and kills all these children. Now, if God didn't want those children to die and really wanted the wise men to go straight to the Magi, to go straight to Bethlehem, he would have warned them before they got to Jerusalem. But he waits till after Jerusalem in Bethlehem and then warns them, which means that he actually wanted Herod to be involved in the story, and he actually wanted Herod to kill those innocent people. And this is recognized by certain Christian theologians as being a thoroughly morally problematic thing for God, because it looks like the birth of Jesus necessarily brings about the death of innocent children. Do you have anything to say on that? Because actually, we're going to talk about the massacre of the innocents now.
Yeah. I was going to just highlight one tiny thing about the message that the wise men got. It wasn't from a vision, but specifically a dream. And I only highlight that difference
that's a good point,
because Matthew is big on dreams, and strangely enough, he has like all this dreaming stuff happening in the first couple chapters, and then nothing until almost the very end of the gospel. And why he's doing that, I think, is a little bit interesting, and that might come up later when we talk about the intended audiences or purposes of our gospel authors. I was just going to highlight that ever so slight
Well,
point.
so let's do that actually, because we started off. You're a bit late to the last one, and I was kind of talking about that, I think, as you came. So there are two audiences, and I talked about audience, purpose, task. So if you're writing anything or giving any kind of content to anyone, right, verbal or written, you always need to be taking into account who your audience is and what your objective is, and those two things will dictate the form, the content of what you deliver. So in the terms of the gospel, the audience and the objective of the authors will determine how they write the gospels. And these two authors, Matthew and Luke, write their gospels exceptionally differently. And they, in fact, the components of each of the nativity stories are very different. In fact, they don't overlap at all. The only thing that is a commonality is that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And then goes to Nazareth. That's basically the only agreement they have, the only explicit agreement. So what explains that? So it could well be that A, they have different agendas, different objectives, and B, they have different audiences. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the audiences of both?
Yeah, so it's usually considered that the author of the Gospel of Matthew is intending this much more for a Torah observant sect of Christianity. He seems to be the most explicit that if you want to be in the
Can
good
you
graces...
just explain what the Torah is for those who might not know?
Okay. Yeah, the Torah is the most important books in Judaism. These are the books of Moses, the ones that are basically supposed to tell you, here's how to basically do Judaism right. And the controversy in early Christianity that you see in the letters of Paul is, do you still have to follow the various laws in the Torah? Do you have to still keep kosher, or can you start eating ham sandwiches? Do men have to circumcise? And many, many, many other details. Usually a lot of the things that are, pretty difficult to convince people to convert. You tell someone about Judaism and about worshiping the one true God, the creator of the whole universe. Someone gets interested, and they say, all right, if you want to join, you need to lop off part of your dick. Okay, I'm going to pass. The controversy then becomes, is it now the case that with our new salvation paradigm, do we now need to still continue to follow the old ways? And that you can see as the big argument that Paul is having, and that split still exists for decades after. Matthew is explicit, saying, no, every jot and tittle of the law will remain basically until the very last days. And basically until the kingdom of God finally comes to earth, which is what we would call the end. So that is what Matthew's about. So he is being explicit about being extremely pro-Torah, being very following the traditional ways, and pushing back at anyone who wants to be a little bit too liberal in their understandings of the needs of the Torah.
And in that respect,
yeah.
Oh, sorry, just to stay on Matthew, in that respect, this then explains why he has Jesus being chased away by Herod, who kills a bunch of children looking for him. Jesus or his family run away to Egypt, and then after they stay in Egypt until Herod the Great dies, and it's safe to come out, they come out of Egypt to fulfill a prophecy, which is, out of Egypt I call my son Israel, which is basically making Jesus look like the new Moses and Herod looking like Pharaoh. And this is a retelling. You can talk about Pesha, Midrash, and all these kind of rabbinic ways of reforming stories to make them more current. This is making Jesus the new Moses and retelling that Moses story. And so why is he doing that? Because his audience are Torah observant Jews, and this will speak to them. They're like, right, okay, I get this. Jesus is the Messiah. He's fulfilling prophecy, and that prophecy comes from the Torah or from books of the wider rabbinic sort of literature. And I get this. You are speaking to me. You're speaking my language. And then you have the Magi being the ones. Do you want to just, before we go into Luke, do you want to tell us why, for Matthew's audience, the Magi might be quite interesting figures to use?
Yeah, so the key thing is that the Magi, specifically by calling them Magi from the East, these are people that are outside of Judaism. They're from a completely different religious tradition, what Jews would call the Gentiles. So the fact that the first people to come and worship, and the key word there is worship, the Messiah, are non-Jews, so people outside of Judaism, is part of something that you actually find that takes place at the end of the gospel of what's called the Great Commission. Once Jesus is resurrected, he tells his disciples, hey, I'm back. I'm going to go to heaven for a while. While I'm away, you guys need to go and preach to all the nations and basically bring everyone into the greater fold now. The Great Commission is basically to go to both the Jew and the Greek, to use more Pauline language. So the fact that you have that parallelism that at the beginning of the Jesus story, you have Gentiles coming to worship, and that at the end, Jesus commands you will go to the Gentiles to bring them into worship. It seems like that is part of the purposeful structuring. And then conversely, the Jewish authorities at the beginning of the gospel story are basically wicked and trying to destroy Jesus. At the end of the story, they're also trying to do the same. It's the Jewish authorities that come up with the lie that the disciples had stolen the body, and they were trying to basically create a conspiracy to hide these facts, to try to suppress the new religion. So always Matthew is basically poo-pooing the religious authorities and basically saying the old Judas, the old state of Israel is basically doomed and corrupt. Go out to the rest of the world and bring people into the new Israel.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And if you want, I mean, I talk about this a lot in my book, The Resurrection: A Critical Examination of the Easter Story. So please grab that, and you can find the details of what Aaron's talking about there. But I think I've done a video explicitly on this, which is the guards at the tomb. And you talk. This is to say that the Jewish authorities there are kind of, there's another element of them sort of contriving this scenario whereby, you know, X, Y, and Z, and you know, we're going to put these guards there, and we know that these Christian people are going to try and hoodwink us or whatever, or X, Y, and Z. So the Jews are the bad guys in that respect. In other words, what Matthew appears to be doing is appealing to the Jewish audience, but saying, here we've got a new Judaism. Would that be fair?
Yeah. It's very similar to what you also see like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they seem to be extremely pro-Torah, but they are against the temple cult because they thought it become corrupted. And you see that even on the lips of Jesus when he goes into the temple square and starts basically, start flipping tables because he's so angry about what he sees there. That was an argument that had been happening within Judaism for decades, even up to the final Jewish war and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
And you would have had Zoroastrianism of the Magi, probably, being the big competitor for Judaism at the time, and thus Christianity, which could have been seen as a Jewish cult, effectively, or movement. So for Matthew to say, look, we're going to take these wise men, these Magi, these super important people from within that culture, from our competitors, and they are going to worship our new Messiah, then you get that extra layer of meaning. And that will speak to the audience as well. So that's why Matthew does a lot of using Torah scripture, and he does that throughout his writing. The resurrection accounts are full of it, but here in the Nativity we have a lot, and then we also have him, having Jesus sort of replaying Old Testament figures who are super important. So Moses, so for the Jews, Moses is like your number one guy. He's a writer of the Torah. The Christians call the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. He wrote them for the traditionalists. So if Jesus is the new Moses, like, who is your big number one dude? Right, Moses. Right, well, Jesus is better than that. Here is him doing the Moses story, right? And the slaughter of the innocents and coming out of Egypt. And then he's going to be our new Messiah who's bigger and better than Moses. What Moses can do, Jesus can do better, type thing. So that's where he's going. Luke, on the other hand, has a completely different audience and way of writing. Do you want to talk to that at all?
Yeah, so the first thing, like I mentioned, how Matthew is extremely pro holding on to the Torah and its laws. The way that you can see what Luke's theology is probably most clearly in the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, the Book of Acts. In particular, Peter is
which he supposedly wrote as well.
Right. Stylistically, they're both the same. They're both like getting out to the same audience. Most every scholar thinks that Luke and Acts is by the same author. One is the sequel to the other, ultimately. In Acts, there is a vision that is given to Peter, where he is grieving about, going out and preaching to Gentiles and having dinner with them, because if he does that, is he going to break Torah? And he's basically given a vision directly from heaven to basically say, go have pork sandwiches, which is an interesting way for God saying, that whole Torah thing, forget about it.
Yeah.
Which clearly is so strongly against what Matthew is all about, that not a jot or tittle will be removed from the law. We will hold to everything as strongly or even more strongly than what the Torah says. In the discourses, Jesus says to not covet other people's wives, and that is like, if you even look at a woman with lust, you've committed sin. Rip your eyes out if you need to, cut your dick off if you need to, whatever it takes to not sin. Just completely over the top on those sorts of things. And Luke in Luke Acts is just like, we like ham sandwiches. We're gonna do this now.
Yeah.
So it is clearly to an audience that is not so strict on maintaining the law. This is for people who are either Gentiles or another term that's often used is God-fearers. Basically, people who are not following the Torah but are still really enamored with Judaism and would like to join in. But if they can do it without circumcision, they would be all on board.
And also, it's worth noting that Luke is a fairly proficient Greek writer. He's writing in Greek, as are all the gospel writers, which is interesting because all these stories happened, Jesus would have spoken Aramaic almost certainly, so on and so forth. But we've got him writing and being pretty proficient in Greek, using a lot of possibly homage to Homer and whatnot, although that could be Mark, but certain elements of Luke, if you read Dennis MacDonald and others. So the idea is that his audience could well be sort of diaspora Jew or Christians living in areas outside of where these stories took place. And so he's going to be using that kind of, I guess, the idea is he's learning how to write Greek. So when you learn to write Greek, you read all the classics and you take all those tropes and those themes and those ways of writing and you incorporate them into how you are writing, right? So for Luke, things are important for the Greeks. So things like the bucolic lifestyle, shepherds are really important, and they have a certain place in Greek literature. So when you see Matthew having the Magi in his story, but not having the shepherds, right? I mean, you've got two completely different stories here, right? This much is obvious, but they both fit within their agendas and with their audience. So Matthew, the Magi are super important for his Torah-loving audience, and for Luke, who are maybe read in Greek literature, living outside in diaspora communities, he's talking about the shepherds, and the shepherds are important. So do you have anything to say about the shepherds being used as a vehicle?
Not too much to that, but I will reiterate, when it comes to the education that Luke must have had, the way we can know about Luke's education is that we actually have a lot of documentation from antiquity about how teaching was done back then. In fact, we even have found among various papyri people's homework. So we can actually tell pretty well how education worked back then. And in the same sort of way that, like, when I was in high school, I had to read Shakespeare and even try to emulate Shakespeare, the same sort of thing was done with Homer. You had to both read Homer and even try to emulate Homer. So the fact that you see that sort of thing going on in the Gospels is just like, yeah, they passed high school.
Yeah, and I could bore you and go and get a book, Dennis MacDonald's book, Mark and Homeric Epics, or whatever it's called. Really good book, worth reading.
What you really want to do if you want to be bored is watch my attempt back in high school of actually reproducing Romeo and Juliet on an old camcorder. That will either put you to sleep or you will just never want to talk to me again. I'm not sure which.
Nice. So Luke chooses. Well, the way I interpret this is Luke is saying that, okay, we want Jesus to appeal to the earthly, to the humble, to the meek. Not shepherds are a really useful vehicle for that. They're not your rich magi, important, educated, cosmologically or astronomically educated people from the east. These are your shepherds out there in the fields tending their flocks, and he uses them as a vehicle to appeal to his audience, right? And so Jesus, the angels appear to the shepherds. They come and worship Jesus. Now, both authors, you have this weird scenario where both these groups of people, the magi and the shepherds, would be really, really important evangelizers for this event. They have seen the most incredible thing that you can imagine seeing, which is a birth, or they haven't seen the birth, but they've seen that the baby human version of God. Now, I don't think that Luke and Matthew actually believed this at the time. I think they actually thought Jesus was a Messiah and not the God, and not actual God. I think that kind of Trinitarian understanding of Jesus in the Godhead came later, post John. But either way, these people would have seen the baby Messiah, right? The incredible sight of the baby Messiah, and worshipped, and then had visions from, or dreams and visions and whatever from up on high. And you would expect these guys to go back and tell everyone they will ever meet and have ever met, find out people to say, you won't believe what's just happened. But from both of these sections of people, we have complete and utter silence, such that Christianity is not a thing for another 30 years. There's no talk about the Messiah being born. It seems that even Mary forgets about it when we have the story of Jesus being 12. And just this bizarre, nonsensical kind of narrative, because of course it's not about the sense of the narrative. It's about, I'm just making claims about who Jesus is, and I'm appealing to you as my audience. You don't have to join the dots to make this but hang on. And the other thing is that these communities won't have necessarily read these stories from the gospels from the other authors. So you'll be a Matthean community, or a Lucan community, or a Markan community, and we look at these things now and think, well, they all have to make sense together as one coherent, like, Jesus narrative, whereas at the time they're writing stories from their own agenda for their communities. And it's not like they're going to be going, hang on, that doesn't make sense because we've got the census here, and Matthew wrote about, because they might not have had access to Matthew's gospel. I mean, we just don't know. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling here, but the point is that you've got two distinct agendas, two distinct audiences, and they are using different vehicles to deliver the importance of Jesus, and to say that Jesus appeals to the rich and important, and to the low and poor. And from both of those communities, we never hear about Jesus again. I mean, do you have anything to add to that, Screed?
Da 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 da. But I mean, besides, a drum set. One thing I should add as well, that you mentioned, like, the shepherds don't really mention anything, the wise men don't mention anything, and I always like to come in and say, but wait, it's even worse, because
I like
we
it
actually have testimony from the Zoroastrian priesthood from centuries later that basically shows not only do they have no memory of members of their caste going and worshiping a Jewish Messiah, we actually have, in like the 3rd century, inscriptions they left basically saying the Zoroastrian religion is so awesome that we are going to persecute Jews and Christians. Which is like, sure, that sort of thing you would go with if literally members of your caste thought it worth worshiping the founder of the Christian religion. So it's like, not only is it not silence, but basically people also shouting, we ain't got nothing to do with this. No, no, no.
Yeah, and it just seems bizarre when you think about it. And another bizarre thing is Herod, right? And let's talk a little bit about Herod, and perhaps you could give us an introduction as to how you understand Herod as a ruler and a historical figure. But you've got this very odd situation where almost certainly Herod would have been about to die here, as according to any of the history that we might, even if you interpret it as charitably as possible, Herod is just about to die, right? We know that Herod was quite ill towards the end of his life, to the point where he wanted to commit suicide, right? So, and we've got some evidence of this, and here we have a guy that apparently, first of all, doesn't really know doesn't appear to be common knowledge that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. It's like the scribes have to go away and kind of remind themselves of this. So that's weird. And then you would have thought that he would have razed Bethlehem to the ground or something, or at least he would have set up in Bethlehem if this is common knowledge, and then had his children there, and then go, hey, they're the Messiah. Like, if everyone genuinely knew this, if this was a thing, this was really a proper prophecy, then Bethlehem would be the biggest city in the region. But it's not. And so you've got this guy that's very ill, we know, towards the end of his life, suicidal, going, I'm going to kill this child because when he becomes an adult 18, 20 years later, he's going to be the king. Like, Herod would have been well dead by then, and he would have known he would have been well dead. And we know he wasn't really bothered about his legacy because he kind of leaves his children to kind of fight amongst themselves as to what's going to go on with the kingdom after that. And so it's really odd that he's so obsessed with taking out this Jesus figure when it doesn't fit in with the rest of these facts. I mean, I know this isn't hugely strong evidence, but it's kind of circumstantial evidence to say that, yeah, Herod's acting a bit bizarrely here to go around killing children just so that he kind of hopes to get this kid that's eventually going to become king in 20 years' time or whatever. Do you have any thoughts about Herod? Well, tell us how you understand Herod as a ruler.
Yeah. So Herod is basically, throughout his entire reign, knew he was in a precarious position. The only reason that basically he ever got the job of being king of Judea was partially nepotism. So just to give a little bit of background, the way that Herod was able to become even a substantial figure in Judea at that time was because of what his father had done. When Julius Caesar was going around being very Caesar-like, and in particular, he got himself into trouble in Alexandria, and it was basically being seized by the Egyptian army, while also probably sleeping with Cleopatra. Caesar is desperate, and he's like asking for help, and among the people that came to help him was Herod's father, Antipater. And because ultimately Antipater helped Caesar being successful, Caesar rewarded him for basically saying, okay, you are going to basically run things in Judea. And then when Antipater then either died or retired, I forget which, then basically Herod and his older brother were basically running things. And this was true up until the point that basically Caesar has been assassinated. Everything in the eastern provinces has gone haywire, and the Parthians try coming in. And with Parthian help, basically Herod has to run for his life. His brother is actually captured and killed. And Herod is then ultimately able to take the throne again with Roman help. And he always knows that the reason he's in this position is because Rome is backing him, and ultimately he needs that backing because he's technically not even Jewish. He's not of one of the traditional 12 tribes. He's an Idumean. So he always knows he's treated as this outsider. He knows he's there because of ultimately Roman support. So he's paranoid, and in some ways rightfully paranoid. And of course it also means that if he actually is going to be, just like you were saying, worried about somebody coming up from Bethlehem that's going to either usurp him or his the people coming after him, yeah, it sure seems like there'd be a nice little fence around Bethlehem to minimize the number of messiahs coming and going. And of course, at the very least, if these wise men are coming in and telling him, yep, the person taking your job has been born, instead of just trusting these folks, he probably would have been in tow, or just saying, all right, you just stay put, let me go take care of some things, and then the army goes and just kills everyone in Bethlehem, because that would work too. I mean, why trust people you don't trust? Because that is the key thing. Herod has historically been paranoid. He was paranoid about, within his own family, he killed several of his own kids, so much so that Caesar Augustus had an interesting pun about Herod. It's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Better to be his huios than his horse. The pun works better in Greek, obviously.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, this like, oh gosh, this family. So if Herod is, this willing to basically even kill like his children, his beloved wife, things like that, these complete outsiders from another country who originally basically chased him out of Judea and killed his brother, he's not going to just trust them to just follow his instructions. And by the way, these people are also coming in to say, you ain't king no more. It's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, you guys are totally cool. You just, we're just gonna hang out. We're gonna have a couple glasses of wine, and then you can go take a trip, and then you can tell me all about it. It's like, and we'll share photos and have nachos. It's like, no, this is not Herod. This is totally
And
completely
to add,
against that
yeah,
character.
it's a really, really good point, this. And so what happens is, as you say, he's very trusting, and he sends the Magi away, says, yeah, come back and tell me where they're born, because I want to go down and worship him too. Now, we talked about this a little bit last time, which is to say that he would have either followed them to Bethlehem, to Jesus, or would have escorted them in a very austere manner, such
Mm-hmm.
that they showed him precisely on point of death where Jesus was to be born. But he's completely out of character. Just says, yeah, I trust you, you'll come back and see me. And of course they don't. And how best to interpret this other than Matthew using this as a mechanism to get Herod involved in the story, so he can become the new Pharaoh and kill the innocents. So
Mm-hmm.
that is really what's going on here. But D.H. Strauss, who was a sort of German critical scholar from several hundred years ago, sort of recognizes the weirdness here, because what happens, and I'll read from my book, page 109, there is another fundamental problem with the behavior of Herod, as it is so well set out by Strauss, 1860, page 159. In Matthew 2:7-8, we have the following state announcement. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem. So it's like, why does he want to know the exact time the star appeared? So before sending the Magi to Bethlehem, he's finding out the position of the star for an as yet unknown reason. But verse 16 indicates a reason, as Herod, quote, sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi, end quote. Yet how can this have happened with this chronology? As Strauss says. So the idea here is like as a writer, you don't really care, like especially this kind of writing. It's not about accuracy, it's about storytelling. But it's like they have Herod definitely locating the position of the star, so at a later point in the story he can then know who to kill when
Mm-hmm.
looking for Jesus. But of course he doesn't know at the moment. He's not going to know where Jesus is. But this plan, so Strauss says, but this plan of murdering all the children in Bethlehem up to a certain age was not conceived by Herod until after the Magi had disappointed his expectation that they would return to Jerusalem, a deception which, if we may judge from his violent anger on account of it, Herod had by no means anticipated. Prior to this, it had been his intention to obtain from the Magi on their return so great a description of the child, his dwelling and circumstances, that it would be easy for him to remove his infantine rival without sacrificing any other life, so on and so forth. In other words, I mean, it's not like you can think of why this might have happened, but again, you're starting to piece all these things together and think this is just a weird story, unless the only objective of the author is to get Herod involved to become the new Pharaoh. End of. Then it all makes sense.
Right, right. Yeah, it does feel like it is a bit forced. And on the other hand, if it were in the hands of a different author, I could imagine the George R. R. Martin version of this. But then the story of Jesus would have been much more the Red Wedding, and there would still been a slaughter. But then Jesus would also have been, you know, eliminated early on. It better or
Indeed.
worse story? I don't know.
So what you then have is a slaughter of the innocents, and this, although I have to say there are many different interpretations of how many kids are actually killed here, and some people say hundreds and hundreds of children are killed, and other people say it's probably only a couple of dozen children. And either way, yeah. It actually does fit in with the kind of thing you can imagine Herod doing. Like, Herod was a pretty horrible person, and yeah, that's the kind of horrible thing he would have done. However, it doesn't appear in any history or any claim about. Are you still there, Aaron? Have I lost you? Can everyone else hear me? Or have I just? Oh, you're back again. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this claim of Herod killing these innocent children because he's looking for Jesus, doesn't know exactly where he's born, so he's just killing all the children about the same age, doesn't appear in any history or in any reference to Herod ever. Now, some people claim, some Christians will claim, argument from silence is not a valid argument. But you would kind of expect this to be in some very detailed historical analysis or historical accounting of Herod's life, would you not? I mean, what were your thoughts on this?
Well, considering what we are told by Josephus of what Herod wanted to do upon his death that didn't happen, and yet we know those details. So, for example, allegedly, when Herod died, he wanted to make sure people would be crying for him, and so he had planned that a whole bunch of the elites in Jerusalem would actually be basically rounded up and slaughtered, so that way people would have something to cry about. And that never happened. But if we can know about something that actually didn't happen, wouldn't it be weird that Josephus didn't talk about something equally terrible that did happen in just around the same time? Even if it was only a couple of infants, just the idea that Herod was so paranoid he was going after babies in other towns because of what star worshippers were telling him, that sounds like Mad King sort of stuff that would definitely make it into Josephus's stories of reasons why Herod was a tyrannical loony, especially towards the end of his life.
Absolutely. It seemed really bizarre that this isn't mentioned. The argument for silence is a valid argument if you'd expect this to be mentioned. So just the kind of anecdote I'd often give is something like, well, just you claim that your house was burgled last night, and I look around and say, well, there's no evidence that, or your house was broken into last night, and I say, well, there's no evidence that I can't see any evidence is broken in, so therefore it didn't happen. And you say, yeah, but it could still have happened. It's just that actually you just can't see any evidence for that. Someone still could have jimmied a window open and left it so it looked like it wasn't. So, just because there's no evidence doesn't mean it definitely didn't happen. But if you expect to see evidence for something, so if you said that there was an earthquake 7.5 on a Richter scale in our town that we live in, and I then look for the evidence, there's no broken windows, no broken buildings, there's no reports in the media, no one knows about everyone I speak to, no one says anything. Okay, that silence is disconfirming, right? Because I would expect there to be people corroborating your claim. So here, I would expect there to be corroborating evidence for the slaughter of the innocents, even if the number of children killed was only in the tens or whatever. This would still be a noteworthy thing for because at the end of the day, if Herod is saying there's a threat to my throne, there's a Jewish Messiah, just for Herod to even be killing people because the new Messiah has been born, like that, just him believing that the new Messiah has been born is a big thing, right? And then to kill these people, that not being in any of the accounts of Herod's life is weird, and I think is a problem for the truth of Matthew. But also, you don't hear about it in Luke, and you don't hear about it in Mark and John and Paul. So that, I think, is a problem.
Yeah, the fact it's also instigated by international forces should also make it even more of an historical event, because you literally have people coming from another country, part of another government, and instigating this attack on infants. It sure seems like it goes from internal thoughts of Herod to actionable historical events with cause and effect across international borders.
Absolutely. And as mentioned earlier, this is also a really big moral problem for God, because it looks like the birth of Jesus, and as I mentioned earlier, that this has presented some problems for theologians as they try and explain this, but it does look like the birth of Jesus necessarily brings about the pain and suffering of other people, innocent babies, innocent young children up to the age of 2.5 or whatever it was, and that is theologically problematic for the existence of this perfect deity. Would you agree with that?
It basically seems like the only way to defend God in this is to use the same defense God does in Job. I beat up a sea dragon, therefore I do what I want.
Yeah, which I always find a little bit dodgy. Sorry, you're going to say something else?
I was going to say, well, you fight Leviathan and see how you think about afterwards.
Yes. So this is, I'm just seeing, this is a good quote. Jesus' birth is responsible for that outcome. Harvey Cox, teacher of a Jesus and morality course, amongst other things at Harvard, admits in the book When Jesus Came to Harvard, Making Moral Choices Today in 2006. In this case, Jesus did, at least indirectly, cause the death of the children of Bethlehem. Ironically, although Christians often say of Jesus, he died for us, in this case, those children died for him. That is a big problem. Um, some people say, his death was foreshadowed in the death of these young. That's one way of looking at it. But again, these people are being used instrumentally, and it's a really big moral problem. Is there anything else you want to say about the slaughter of the innocents?
Just also that it's fitting the larger typology of what you mentioned before of Jesus trying to fit the Moses story. The
Yeah.
slaughter of the infant males is parallel to what Pharaoh had done to the Egyptian Jewish boys, especially as described in the version of the story by Josephus. That he also basically has Moses' father getting visions or dreams beforehand about what's going to be happening, and and the Pharaoh explicitly being told about a ruler who will rise up out of the Jewish people to overthrow Pharaoh's control. So it becomes even more explicit a parallel to what we see in the Jesus story. So is Jesus like Moses? Matthew is just making this one more example to say, hell yeah.
I just want to say, so Bob, who was on last time, who's written a book on, uh, uh, it's an attempt to harmonize the Matthew and Luke gospel accounts of the Nativity. And you talked last time about the Chaldeans, and you said actually, you set him straight on something. And I do like this from Bob. He says, thanks to Aaron, as a result of the interaction, Ari the Magi, I have pulled my book from Amazon until I make some changes. He says, you convinced me that the Chaldean scholars I depicted wouldn't have described themselves as Magi, but that misapplied term was common in the greater Greco-Roman influence world. And that was a point that you labored, or not labored, but you made to some extent in the last video. And that's really great that he's gone, okay, let's see if that holds up. He's gone and looked into it, and it appears to hold up. So that's good for you, Aaron, but also good for someone who's willing to adapt their views based on new data. So fantastic.
Yeah, I love it when we can check each other because I don't have everything right either. Show me the evidence, I'll lovely change my mind. And I'm glad that we can have the interactions that let us all try to get a little bit closer to truth.
Absolutely. So the
And I
next,
should
oh,
also note that he is also right that often Chaldeans, Magi, they can be conflated in Western sources. That in the same sort of way, Americans may not always know what the difference between Iraqi and an Iranian is. Uh,
yeah.
they're all people over there. In the same way, Greco-Roman sources can also treat everyone from Babylonia or from Persia as just people over there. So that confusion exists. Better authors do a good job of separating out the two, but not always.
Cool stuff. Okay, so then we're going to go on to the flight to Egypt. So what happens, and again, this only appears in Matthew's gospel. This is very weird. So if Jesus goes to live in what is estimated to be about 2 years in Egypt in Matthew's account, because what has to happen is he gets chased away to Egypt, because it's not safe to live in the Bethlehem area because Herod's going around trying to kill children up to the age of 2.5. So Joseph and family go to Egypt, and the idea is that they stay there until Herod the Great dies, and Matthew's fairly clear on this. That most estimations are that's probably going to be maybe 2 years. I mean, it's give or take, right? But they're going to be living in Egypt perhaps for as long as 2 years, and then they come out of Egypt and fulfill this prophecy: "Out of Egypt I will call my son Israel," which then says that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the new Moses, all this kind of stuff. Okay, but that's really interesting because, as mentioned, Luke doesn't mention that at all. So it's like Luke saying, right, I'm going to write a story of Jesus' nativity. I'm going to do this. They're going to get down there, the census, which Matthew doesn't use. They're going to do this. There's going to be the shepherds that see him. Matthew doesn't use. And I'm going to look at. So if you are a harmonizer, a Christian harmonizer, and you think that Matthew and Luke's claims are all correct, they're all cohesive, then Luke must be sitting down and saying, I'm going to write an account of Jesus' birth, and I know everything about Jesus' birth, and I'm going to choose not to include the Magi from the east. I'm going to choose not to include them getting Herod involved, who's a king of the country at the time, and I'm going to choose not to have Herod killing babies on account of Jesus' birth, and I'm going to choose not to include Jesus going to live in Egypt for 2 years. And I'm going to choose not to include him coming out of Egypt to fulfill a prophecy that shows he's a Messiah. And instead, I'm going to have, and this is where an outright contradiction comes. And when I debated with Lydia McGrew, this was one of the points that actually she found, although she didn't find it terminal, this was a problematic one, which is that Jesus goes back to in Luke's account, goes back to Nazareth straight away after the birth via circumcision or via the temple in Jerusalem. And so you've got a really, really problematic situation here where these two accounts don't agree. And even if you think they are harmonizable, what the hell is Luke thinking not to include all the what you would think of the most awesome, juiciest parts of the story?
Exactly. Yeah, he is clearly avoiding what Matthew is putting down, assuming Luke knows Matthew. Obviously, that's a different argument, and whether the nativity is true or not is mostly, I would say, independent of the question of the synoptic problem. But either way, Luke clearly either does not know about all these stories that the Holy Family went through, or he does know about it and he's just like, nah, that's not part of my story. Either way, that is bizarre.
So the quote from Luke is actually this. Now, when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken of the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son, so on and so forth. And I'll skip to a later verse. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take this child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. And when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea, so this was Herod's son, Herod the Great's son, Herod Archelaus, who was tetrarch of Judea, in place. So he ruled for 10 years, and we know this from history. So he ruled for 10 years, but he did such a bad job that the Romans decided to take Judea back as a province of their own and not a client kingdom, and that's why you had the tax census of Quirinius, which is why the two stories just cannot be coherent,
Mm-hmm.
mutually coherent. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after it being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in the city of Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets: he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, this will bring us onto another thing worth talking about in a second, but you have this idea. Sorry, did I mention Luke? I meant Matthew, if I said Luke earlier. But here we have, you know, Matthew's story not being corroborated anywhere, and well, actually, the idea here is that Jesus is a Nazarene. Now, this has caused, I'll talk about that now, actually. This has caused a lot of problem in scholarly studies because people are trying to work out what is meant by Nazarene here
Mm-hmm.
and what Matthew is referring when he says the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene, because no one quite knows what prophecy he's really talking about. Not the only time I think Matthew is referring to prophecies that people are trying to work out. Do you have anything to say about Nazarene?
Yeah, so the hypothesis that I give the greatest weight to, and it can only be a hypothesis because we can't really be sure, is I think this comes from Isaiah, specifically 11:1, where it talks about the branch, or in Hebrew, the netzer.
Yeah.
Um, and that I think might be the best guess as to what might be going on. That netzer becomes Netzarene. It's also worth noting that the term Nazarene itself doesn't actually mean one who comes from the town of Nazareth.
No.
It doesn't actually linguistically indicate that. So it becomes all the more confusing that it's not even like the sort of way that you would say you're a Nazareth person. So like right now I live in Boston. The grammatical way of referring to me is a Bostonian. You wouldn't call me a Bostonine. You would look at that and you'd say, either I don't know English or I have some weird etymology going on for that. It's a similar thing here with Nazarene. You would have something like Nazarethanos or something to that effect of how you would put it if you wanted to say someone from the town of Nazareth. So it's already a weird thing of what Matthew is doing, and I kind of glom onto the idea that it's based off the Hebrew word netzer because one, it's messianic, and two, it fits into what to me looks like a larger pesher that Matthew is doing in the first couple chapters of his gospel. Um, and especially because he's doing this whole thing about relating to coming out of Exodus, coming out of captivity, and this is part of Isaiah's talk about basically the return of the various tribes of Israel and becoming reunited again. And that this Netzer, this branch, is going to be instrumental to that. So that's why I guess that. But even so, it's really actually also linguistically hard to get from Netzer and the Hebrew there to Nazarene. The consonants aren't quite what you'd expect, so it's immensely complicated, and nobody knows for sure what's going on.
Yeah, I don't want to go into crazy amount more detail about this, but Jesus and Nazarene, I've written several articles on the fact that there are several different. Well, let me just read the initial part to this. So, I recently wrote about the Matthean prophecy, a prophecy that looks like this, and I've told he should be called a Nazarene. This tells us two things. Nazarene means someone from Nazareth, given the causal language involved with moving to Nazareth to fulfill a prophecy. So that's one interpretation what's going on there, or that
Mm-hmm.
someone from Nazareth, being the Messiah, is a fulfillment of the prophecy. He shall be called a Nazarene. I showed in my piece an analysis of the language of the OT prophecy that Nazarene does not mean someone from Nazareth, as you were saying. There is confusion over whether it means someone from Nazareth, someone of the Nazarite religious sect, which Samson was, if I remember
Mm-hmm.
correctly. So the Nazarites
Yes.
are these particular sects that do certain things, and that could be what he's trying to say, or that's what some people think that is going on here, or from the Hebrew word meaning branch. The latter seems the most probable. So I agree with you there that is the most probable interpretation of what's going on. This prophecy is absent from the Old Testament unless it does indeed refer to the branch meaning. Right, so that's what you were saying, that if he's actually saying he shall be called a Nazarene, it comes from the prophets, and the only one that we can actually work out that seems to come from some kind of prophecy is an understanding that it doesn't mean he comes from Nazareth, but that is referring to the Messiah coming from a branch type thing. Now, what that means is that getting him to move to Nazareth because he's called a Nazarene is Matthew butchering the language, which is the
Mm-hmm.
best understanding of that. So the prophecy is meaning the branch, but he's misunderstanding that and applying it to Nazareth, or at least co-opting it because he needs Jesus to be born, or to be living in Nazareth, because Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth. So they are writing about Jesus of Nazareth after he's died. Now they have to have him living in Nazareth, right? But they also have to have him being born in Bethlehem, because that's what they think the prophecy that we talked about in the last episode is requiring. And we talked that actually doesn't mean again, this is another butchering, because it doesn't mean he needs to be born in Bethlehem, just of the house of David.
Mm-hmm.
As a Bethlehemite,
Yeah.
that's why he talks. It talks in the third person, or no, it talks in the second person. He's not talking to a town. He's talking to a person being of the house of Bethlehem. So,
Yeah.
in other words, we've got several butcherings of Old Testament so-called prophecies to try and get this idea of Jesus being both of Bethlehem and Nazareth, and both of them do a disservice to the
Yeah.
actual data.
And we should also mention logistically what a mess this kind of is, because I'm imagining right now, if I'm the Holy Family, I just had to escape Israel and I'm now living in Egypt. I'm living here for months, potentially years. Why would I want to go back? In particular, there's a Jewish community in Alexandria. If they've already moved in and they've been living there for months or years, why not just continue to do that? The only reason they go back to the Holy Land in the first place is because Joseph gets a dream, and he specifically goes to the Galilee because of yet another dream. So it takes multiple angelic interventions to make this story even happen. And basically, every time you need literally a deus ex machina for a person to make a decision, you know this is not, regular thought process. It would have just been much easier to just stay where they were and honestly be safer. Also, the idea that they didn't go back to Bethlehem because of Archelaus, so they went to Nazareth, which was controlled by another one of Herod's sons. It's like, okay, out of the frying pan into the fire. Good job.
Absolutely. So I mean, I could do a whole video on that Nazarene thing itself. Someone was saying, so Dizzy Grizzly was saying, the Nazarenes or Nazareans, a Greek, and gives a Greek there, were an early Jewish Christian sect in the first century Judaism. I deal with that as well in my in my article. So I just placed the article in the live chat there. Those were all migrated from my previous home at Patheos Non-Religious. So loads of my old articles that used to have literally hundreds and hundreds of really academic comment threads of people like weighing into these debates, and now all those comments have disappeared, sadly, as Patheos Non-Religious got rid of all our content and it was all migrated to Only Sky. So anyway, that's just pretty irrelevant, but there's at least the article and the other article that it refers to as well. Is there anything else you want to say about? Oh no. So the other thing I want to mention now, unless you've got anything else on the subjects we just talked about to mention.
No, I think we've covered pretty well on there.
So the other problem is that for Luke, we have the family going straight back to Egypt. Sorry, straight back to Nazareth as soon as Jesus is born, pretty much, and that doesn't fit at all with the Matthean account. So I think this is one of the most overt contradictions, in my opinion. So just to read you Luke 2:22-24, it says, "And when 8 days had passed," right? It's not 2 years. It's not going to Egypt. This is Jesus born. "And when 8 days had passed, before his circumcision, his name was then called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days for their purification, according to the law of Moses, were completed, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord." So this is really important temporal connectives being used here. So when this happened, that happened. If I say to you, when I went to the shops the other day, I could say when I went to the shops the other day, I bought some broccoli. And no, when I went to the shops the other day and bought some broccoli, I met my friend Bob, right? What you can't read from that is me going to the shops to buy some broccoli and meeting my friend Bob. But in between buying some broccoli and meeting Bob, I went to Egypt for 2 years on holiday. Like, there is no way of seriously entertaining the idea just because it's, but maybe he did go to Egypt for 2 years. He just doesn't mention it. And then he says, when the days of purification had passed, Jesus family went to the temple in Jerusalem, and then they went straight home. And it says later that, they go straight back to Nazareth. So this is, in my opinion, is a super clear account of Jesus after being born going straight back to Nazareth that does not accord with the narrative in Matthew. Would you agree?
I think you know what I'm going to say.
Sorry, I keep saying all this stuff and then just giving you a real closed question. Yes or no? Do you agree? And then you have to go, oh God, I've got to pick up from here.
I was also busy myself because I had also noticed that in the comments, Bob had left a message about allegedly an independent source for the slaughter of the innocents.
Right. Do you want to quickly talk about that while I'm going to bring up Luke 2?
Okay. All right. So the normal claim that skeptics like us would make is that no other gospel, no other source independently describes the slaughter of the innocents as described in the Gospel of Matthew. And the fact that it has all these other mythic motifs attached to it, that this is a very common thing for attempted killing of the young savior or kingly figure, especially much like a Moses figure, it seems unlikely. So Bob has, in the chat, said he found a source that actually is from a non-Christian Roman historian talking about this, and says that the quote that I gave earlier about better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son is related to this. And the source he gave, he only gave it the name of the source called the Saturnalia. This comes from Macrobius, who is writing in the 5th century AD.
I deal with this in my book, by the way, and I didn't go into this detail in this video, but thank you for doing that. I do deal with this in the book. Yes, carry on.
Yeah. So one, that means this is a rather late source. I mean, literally 5 centuries, or like literally 400-ish years after the fact. And two, we know he's mistaken because the quip that we find is actually originally in Josephus. And when Josephus describes it, this was when Herod was actually going and trying to get permission from Caesar Augustus to execute one of his sons, because at this point he needed permission about killing sons and who's going to then be getting the inheritance and things like this. And it was in that context that Augustus was supposed to make this quip. So this is Herod going to Rome to get permission to kill one of his sons, not in response to what had happened to a bunch of infants in another town, which also wouldn't make sense, because why would the pun about Herod's sons make sense if he's going and killing a completely different family? So Macrobius is just conflating things here. And again, conflating things here centuries after, and once the gospel story had become an extremely well-known phenomenon. So no, this is not an independent attestation.
Absolutely, I'd absolutely agree. If you're interested, I deal with the Macrobius claim on page 133 in my book. So as I say, the problem with using Macrobius is that he has overlaid the original quote from Augustus with reference to the massacre of the innocents rather than what is thought to be the original subject, Herod's murder of his own children. See Raymond Brown. So Raymond Brown, the Catholic exegete, agrees with this. I mean, this is a Catholic, one of the best exegetes in the world, really, historically speaking, saying, yeah, no, this doesn't add up. So he's not a fan. The quote relies on a pun, as you say, comparing Herod's brutality to his own son with the notion that he wouldn't eat pork. Macrobius appears to be supplying a setting to the quote based on his own and contemporary, albeit pagan, but contextually Christian reading. Brown also concludes that it is likely that, quote, the setting in Macrobius has been influenced by the story in Matthew. So importantly, the key here, as Brown also claims, is that, quote from Brown, Matthew did not draw upon an account of historical events, but rewrote a pre-Matthean narrative associating the birth of Jesus, son of Joseph, with the patriarch Joseph and the birth of Moses. So, and this is where I go on to say, this is the heart of the matter. And what Brown sees as concerning history and verisimilitude, however, I've made pains to establish on what foundation is the verisimilitude built if there is no history. So if, Raymond Brown's willing to say, yeah, he's basing this on that, and that's it's not historically really didn't happen, then but it's still theologically true. It's like, yeah, and don't know you can do that. But yeah, the Macrobius claim is a real problem. Just unless you have anything else to say on Macrobius at all.
No, that's everything that's relevant, unless we want to do an exegesis on Macrobius.
Okay, I'm just going to share that tab instead. Is that right? Okay, I just wanted to go back to I'm really because this causal language, this temporal language is super important. Like, this is an outright disagreement, because if this is true, if what Luke is saying here is true, then Matthew's account is false, right? So if Luke's account of events happened, Matthew's Herod getting involved in the story and chasing Jesus off to Egypt for 2 years, and him coming out and blah 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 and fulfilling prophecy to be a Messiah didn't happen, and that is big, right? One of these is not true, possibly, probably both. So Jesus has the shepherds being involved, and the shepherds went back glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, just as had been told, right? Already that's a problem, because they didn't do that. We have no evidence that they glorified at all, right? So we're then never heard from again. And then here, and when 8 days were completed, so that it was time for his circumcision, as I've said already, he was also named Jesus, the name given to him by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days for their purification, according to the laws of Moses, were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. So, born, shepherds, praise, 8 days, Jerusalem. When this happened, that happened. It's super clear here. And then when this finishes in Jerusalem, right, and at this part, the return to Nazareth, and when his parents had completed everything in accordance with the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. So it's a couple of things there. This is their own city, whereas Matthew does not have it as their own city. Matthew has them going there precisely because it's safe, right? So what was a quote from Matthew? Sorry, I'm going to have to look. He said, but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Right. So these are massively contradictory. To me, it's super, super clear here. Right. Matthew, they are not returning to their own city. They are going to Nazareth to fulfill a prophecy, and they just came to Nazareth because it was safe, right? And Archelaus was ruling there. It wasn't their city. They'd never been there before. If they lived there already, Matthew's text would have been written entirely differently. You don't say, if this was their own city that they're just returning to after a couple of years, then they wouldn't, and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill, blah, blah, blah. No.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes no sense. And then the causal language here is really, really clear. And when his parents had completed everything in accordance with the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. Right. None of this narrative allows for a 2-year sojourn in Egypt. It just doesn't. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work. So for me, this is one of the strongest. I'm really, really positive that this is one of the strongest contradictions in the Nativity accounts. And in fact, it's reflective of the accounts don't make any sense at all, because actually, if Luke's account is correct, then none of Matthew's Herod stuff happened. And if none of Matthew's Herod stuff happened, that's a massive part of the whole prophecy of the Messiah and all the big juicy stuff of the Nativity account didn't happen. But if Matthew's account is true, then obviously Luke's stuff couldn't have happened, and all this claim about going to the Jerusalem in the temple like that, the shepherds getting involved and the census, none of that. So these are, in my opinion, just terminally contradictory.
So. Totally agree there. And I mean, there's basically ultimately two arguments here. One is that if Luke knows the story about all those things happening there, why would he literally just yada, yada, yada over all those details? And then secondly, his language is so clear that he doesn't think there's this multi-year time period that the whole family is living away from Nazareth, either in Bethlehem or in Egypt. It sounds like they're down there to get censused. A couple, 8 days after Jesus' birth, they take him to the temple, and then when they're done, they go home. This is like at most a couple week adventure, not a multi-year escapade running away from tyrants and living in foreign lands.
100%. Which then, that's pretty much the end of things. I mean, there are some others, kind of any other business type points. So some people, René Sam, although it's a bit controversial, says that. Sorry, is there anything else that you wanted to add to the points we made so far, Aaron?
Nope.
So René Sam, as an example, in the Myth of Nazareth says, and by assessing, although he's not an archaeologist, he assesses a bunch of archaeological records to conclude that Nazareth didn't actually exist as meaningfully as a settlement until, I think he claims, 80 CE. So after the death of Jesus. So Nazareth didn't exist. So at the time that these guys were writing, Nazareth might have been a place, so that's why they had like Jesus existing in Nazareth, but at the time of his birth it didn't exist as a place, and so therefore saying that he then at his birth time went back to Nazareth is a real problem, as according to archaeological records. However, some people do call that into question, on actually a lot of skeptical scholars don't fully agree with that. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, so I remember early on reading the book from Solomon and finding it very interesting. And I realized, though, at a point that even if I accepted Solomon's conclusions about all of the various artifact datings, if I just completely accepted all of his conclusions at that point, his argument that Nazareth, therefore, wasn't inhabited at the time didn't actually follow. Because one of the problems that Solomon notes is that virtually all of the excavations have been basically in the hills around Nazareth. Like the site that is treated as the birthplace of Jesus on Nazareth is kind of up on a slope. But if you actually go to Nazareth, you'll see that everyone lives at the floor of the valley, because why would you live in a place where you have to walk uphill every day when there's this nice flat plain at the bottom there? But on the other hand, because people are living down where most likely people lived in antiquity, it's really hard to go and do an archaeological dig. You can't say, hey, we're tearing down your house so we can look for first century BC artifacts. It's like, no, I'm living here. Get out of my face. So the fact is, the argument from silence that he tries to build from the digs that he's relying on can't actually lead to his conclusion because we actually can't test the place that would most likely indicate if Nazareth was significantly inhabited in the early first century or not.
When I deal with Psalm's claims, I don't really deal with his claims. I say, here's another theory, take it or leave it, in my Any Other Business chapter. I say, what to me I find most interesting about this is that in 2009, supposedly, as I write here, Christian archaeologists have known that there has been no real indication from in and around Nazareth, and that it was inhabited at the time of the birth of Jesus, which is why an archaeological discovery in Nazareth. So, although you might disbelieve Psalm's claims, there still isn't great evidence that Nazareth was kind of inhabited and blah blah blah. blah. So, there's still a bit of work to be done, maybe if you really want to establish it as a place where people are living. I don't know, you could call that into question, which is why an archaeological discovery in Nazareth that supposedly dates from the period was heralded so gleefully by apologists in 2009. This is how the BBC reported it. Quote, archaeologists in Israel say that they have uncovered the remains of the first dwelling in Nazareth believed to date back to the time of Jesus Christ. A spokeswoman said Jesus and his childhood friends likely knew the home. A lot of supposition there. The archaeologists found the remains of a wall, a hideout, and a cistern for collecting rainwater. And I say, now, given that this evidence stands, then we can see that the myth of Nazareth theory adhered to by the likes of Psalm falls apart. However, things aren't so simple. Surrounding this claim were some very suspicious circumstances. So this is what I'm saying is not so much about Psalm's claim. I'm not so interested in that, but I'm interested in how Christians sometimes do their work. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is well dodgy. So, firstly, the dig was being carried out by the Catholic Church in order to make way for the Mary of Nazareth International Centre. This bias, of course, does not mean that the dig is suspect a priori, but the rest of these points do. This is where it gets dodgy. Right. So the archaeologist Adair Alexandria has not published any of the findings or verified any of the claims. No one else has done so either. The Israel Antiquities Authority published a short statement only to take it off the web soon after. The church remains the only port of call for verifying the claims. The church, rather conveniently, proceeded to build over the remains, meaning it can never be verified. No materials exist in any scholarly record, and in the Catholic literature, this was omitted, quote, up until then, this is what the Catholics said at the time, up until then, that is the recent house discovery, there was no scientific evidence affirming the existence of a village of Nazareth of the epoch of Christ, end quote. This is an explicit admission that there is, apart from this so-called discovery, no evidence to support Nazareth being inhabited at the time of Jesus. So no matter what you say about Psalm's claims and the work he does in his book, like, it's interesting that the Catholic Church says, right, we need to disprove this. So they find this building. They say this dates to the same time as Jesus being born, and then they flatten it and build a center on top of it, so no one could do any subsequent archaeology on that site. They don't publish anything. They say, yeah, this is what we've recorded. These are our findings, and then that's that. Job done. And they also claim that there is no scientific evidence of there being a building at the time of Jesus's birth. So I don't know. I found that pretty interesting, if not the Psalm stuff itself. But there you go. Again, that's me ranting and expecting you to carry on.
I do want to put in a few things here because I remember years ago I had actually emailed Yardine Alexander because she came up a fair bit in Psalm's book, so I wanted to directly confirm some things with her. And while it sounds like there are still things like very slowly in the pipelines for publications, and apparently in archaeology things are about as slow as the movement of the sands of the Sahara itself. Is just a really slow publishing field. But nonetheless, confirming that, they even like before this house discovery that you mentioned, that like in other things they had found like coinage and things like that that would have put itself in the dates of like the Hasmonean reign or the early Herodian range. So at least things that have been confirmed to me, but yet have not been in the peer-reviewed literature yet to confirm that. But it's also worth noting the dig that you mentioned. The Catholic Church was, of course, involved because they owned the territory, but the dig itself was still done by the Israel Antiquity Authority, and Alexander herself is a member of that group. So it's still done by a scientific body. So there are things about it that are a bit sus, and I think a lot of it is marketing hype. But I'm not so willing to go down the almost conspiratorial rabbit hole at this point.
Yeah, and,
but I do want to say
I think
this
that's
much.
fair enough. I think it's fair enough.
But I definitely say I'm also a bit concerned that it's been like Well, let's see. Psalm, I think, wrote his book about Nazareth over 10 years ago, and still these archaeological reports aren't published as far as I know, which, they're slow, and then there's, come on, the glaciers are melting faster than this.
This is true. At the end of my book, and I won't read it out, but at the end of my book, I say, right, in order for the Christians to believe that these events really happened as historical truths, and I go through all the points that I make in throughout the chapters and put them as a bullet pointed list, and it's like, wow, the hoops they have to jump through to see these as historical claims are absolutely phenomenal. And to me, it's just like, the overwhelming evidence is that, and the most plausible explanation is that neither of these accounts are true, and true reporting of historical claims, partly because they're overtly contradictory in places, and partly because even on their own, there's no external corroboration for any of the claims they're in, and in fact, they are also internally problematic. Or problematic just standing on their own, especially when looking at other external documentation, that you are not justified. The Christian is not justified in believing the nativity accounts as being historical truth. And I do the same with the resurrection. And as I said at the beginning of the last video, if you are saying that the birth and the death of Jesus cannot be verified and even can be disconfirmed in the way that they are claimed as being true, as in the way that they are claimed to have happened is not true, then what can you say about all the stuff of Jesus' life in between these two bookends? Like all the ministry of Jesus, how can you prove that that's true? All the miracles of Jesus, who was there? How do you document this? How do you know what Jesus said? Who was there writing it all down? What's a historical methodology involved here? What's a historiography that's involved in giving us these accounts? Why should I believe a 2,000-year-old book with such dodgy provenance and with pretty contradictory claims, and that elsewhere they rely on each other? It's not 4 independent claims, there's 4 codependent claims that also diverge in problematic ways. This is just a big hot mess. Like, if you presented that to me in any other religion, I wouldn't believe it. Just because I've been born and brought up in this Christian context, these things seem more plausible than they really are. Like, if you had presented that to me as a Hindu text and said, right, here's a historiography involved in this text, and this is what the claims are, I would, Christians, I'm sure, would go, well, yeah, that's a load of nonsense, I'm not believing that. But because they're born and brought up in that context, these things have, well, they need to, it needs to be true for them. And so they're prepared to jump through hoops that talk to kind of believing in plausibilities rather than what is the most plausible explanation of the data. So that's my conclusion. What would you say as a conclusion to how you evaluate both Matthew and Luke in the nativity gospel and nativity accounts?
There's the first thing is just in general, when there are positive claims, you should be having positive evidence to back them up. It should not be the case that there's a claim in a book and you believe it until you can disprove it. There should be some reason of why it is more likely than true than not. And of course, once the claims become more and more amazing or are attached to hundreds of many more amazing claims, the fact that some these nativity stories are also part of stories that have zombies, coming around and marching through Jerusalem all the time, and things like that being part of the story, or that this is all supposed to undo the what took place earlier in another book about a talking snake to a rib woman and about something that allegedly happened 6,000 years ago. It's like, okay, this is a whole other category of writing, and to even begin to treat it as historical writing needs not just a ton of evidence, it needs, your favorite phrase, a shed load of it to even get into that territory. And the fact is, not only is there no positive evidence to indicate these things are true, but there's tons of negative evidence and internal contradictions. You just have to say, okay, stop this. These are clearly religious texts with a very different purpose. If we go and understand that, we will do a much better service to these authors than trying to jam-pack their stories together to turn it into yet another crummy Christmas pageant.
And if the viewer doesn't know what Aaron is talking about with regard to zombies coming out, this is Matthew 27 at the death of Jesus. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and rocks were split. None of this is evidence. There's no reports anywhere else outside the Gospels that there was an earthquake. In fact, I think the earthquake is only Matthew, possibly Luke as well. But Matthew's the only one that mentions this. Also, the tombs were opened, and many bodies of saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So you got dead saints were raised up. these are zombies, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. So this is the idea that you've got dead saints appearing to many, but these many is never heard from. We don't hear about this ever again. It's only Matthew that mentions this. So that would be one of the most incredible things that anyone's ever seen, like zombie saints parading that many, he's quite explicit there, many people see. And also Matthew and the Gospels say that Jesus is the first of the resurrection, the general resurrection, Jesus is the first. So actually, no, according to that, the first are the saints. And so that's also a bit problematic. Anyway, if you're prepared to believe stuff like that, then yeah, go for it, mate. Knock yourself out. The Gospels are all yours. You can believe all that stuff. But I don't find that particularly persuasive, and I find it the least plausible explanation of events. And the same with the Nativity. And if you're taking away if these are the only times, the birth and death of Jesus, that where the claims intersect with known history, so we can at least verify them to some extent. So we know what was going on with Herod, we know what's going on with Quirinius, we know what's going on with the census, we know, X, Y, and Z that was happening there. Your work on the Magi and what's the most plausible explanation of that, and the star, and etc., etc. And with the death, we know, Pontius Pilate, we know the death and burial customs of the Jewish people at the time, etc., etc., etc. We know all of these things, right? And none of this jives with the claims in the Gospels. Then we are not justified in believing these claims, and therefore, without these, without the resurrection, but without the birth and resurrection, you've got nothing, and Christianity falls apart. So it is super important, and I don't think there's any historical basis for the belief in Jesus as the Gospels claim. I mean, I'm a historicist, so I think Jesus probably did exist, probably about 66%, and about 2/3 Jesus existed as an itinerant preacher. I'm not a complete mythicist, but I'm also fairly ambivalent. Like, if you disprove that Jesus existed and he was a straight up myth from the beginning, it wouldn't change my views about anything. Like, the important part is the Gospels are not truthful accounts of the life of Jesus.
Exactly, yeah. And it's always worth doing and following the strategy employed by Jonathan Loftus with the outsider test for faith. Would this work if you were looking at this in another religious story or another religious context? And also, to answer some questions in the chat to connect it with that, my background is what is called the Ishtar Gate. This used to be the north gate for the inner sanctum for the city of Babylon. But as you can see in its background, this is currently not in the sands of Babylon. This is actually in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, where it has been moved to. And so, like I said,
it's not in your lounge. I thought it was in your lounge. Okay, sorry.
Let's just say this much: I'm having enough trouble paying the rent here in Boston as it is. For my small apartment to have a place large enough to hold this. Yeah, I'm gonna need a third and fourth job. Yeah, but remind ourselves of the various myths of the Babylonians and the Sumerians. If you read, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's plausible that there was an historical Gilgamesh. He is like in the king's list. And, if he was the king, that's plausible that he helped build the walls of the city of Uruk. But does that also mean that he also took a trip to the eastern lands to try to find immortality, and ultimately the flower that was supposed to give eternal life was stolen by a snake at the last minute? Is this more likely mythology, or are we going to try to find any sort of reason we can say, well, you can't disprove Gilgamesh didn't do this? If that does not sound plausible, then why use the exact same approach for other texts that just have to be important in the Western world?
The Epic of Gilgamesh is important. I think, am I right in saying it's the oldest holy book in the world? It predates the Bible by 1,000 years at any rate.
Yeah. It is a complicated book as well because we have editions of it from over 1,000-year period, so you can also see the various changes. So you can actually also look at its textual history that way. It's perhaps not the oldest myth because it's also using earlier flood myths from Atrahasis.
Atrahasis. Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah,
but it's usually considered the oldest epic narrative.
Yeah,
and it's
that
3,000.
Where I was going with that is so it's about 1,000 years older than you could possibly argue the Bible is, and the Bible probably is actually a lot. sort of later than that. But the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 12, I think it is, talks about the flood, which itself is based on the Atrahasis, as you say. But if anyone's interested, go and find, I think Tablet 12 it is, go and look it up on the internet and read it, because when it gets to the flood bit, you'll start understanding that there are verses verbatim in the Bible that have been taken from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that make sense in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but when seen in the biblical account of the flood, make no sense, like the dove and the raven, and you're like, what's going on there? But it makes sense over in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But there's just like wholesaled it into there, and so those biblical literalists who think the Bible's literally true have to do a pretty good job of trying to explain how it's not actually just basing, at least in that part, basing its stories on pre-existing holy texts from other nations. And when you understand, and we're going completely off topic here, but when you understand that the Israelites were in exile in Babylonia in the sort of 600s BCE, and you understand that they didn't, they were in exile, they needed a national identity, and the prevailing theory amongst most scholars these days is this is when the Bible or the Torah was broadly written, give or take, and added to, and later as well. They write these stories of the Torah in exile to give themselves national identity. They're of course going to be drawing from the culture within which they're exiled. So they're exiled in Babylonia, in Mesopotamia, Sumeria, this kind of area, depends on what age you're talking about. And they're taking these stories from the people around who they are learning from as well, and they're readapting. So Moses in a basket, in a pitch basket, being floated down the river, is Sargon II of Akkad, which is again a Mesopotamian story that predates the Moses story. That's wholesaled. They didn't have pitch in Egypt at the time, so why would you have a story with him in a pitch basket? And it makes, anyway, they're nicking stuff. This is completely off topic, but when you understand the Bible, both New and Old Testament, but particularly Old Testament, the Torah, the Tanakh as a larger set of books, when you understand how it was written and when it was written and the way it was written and edited over time, and the historical, socio political context and historical context that it was written in, when you start understanding that, then you start understanding it's not a literal history of what happened. That's my rant over. I will leave the last things for you to say. And if anyone has any questions, get them in now, please. That would be fab.
Yeah. And just to also connect even more with what's in the background for me. So this
Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
No, don't worry. This gate was built by Nebuchadnezzar, the person who also conquered Israel and basically started the captivity. So the authors of the Torah were perhaps looking at this gate when they were composing their effort to try to maintain their stories and trying to turn that into a coherent response to the circumstances they found themselves in. So they might have literally been looking at this gateway, this doorway, when they decided to have their lamentations and their stories about the fall of the Tower of Babel. Sounds like Babylon? Things like that. And once you realize that, the Hebrew writers of the stories were almost certainly aware of and using the stories of Gilgamesh and others for creating things, and you realize this is actually how religious literature is created, and you can understand the purposes for it, you realize that this is the entire paradigm that one should take to even attempt to understand these books, rather than historical literalism or anything like that. To understand religious literature, look at how it's composed. And how is it composed? Seeing the old, changing the story for a new context, but rarely in contact with what really happened.
So Brain Damage Bob put about pitch was widely manufactured. I did a really big deep dive into pitch. In fact, I'm halfway through writing a book, as I've been for a couple of years. It's been on hold, which is a third part to my series, Nativity, Resurrection, Critical Examination series. Nativity, Resurrection, third one's on the Exodus. I'm co-authoring it with a Canadian archaeologist, but she's been very ill with COVID for actually quite some time, so that's been on hold. But I've done a big deep dive into pitch. So if you want to talk at depth about pitch in the Egyptian area and how available it either was or wasn't, I mean, the simple fact is that almost certainly that trope was stolen off the Babylonians, while in exile. There's no way that story makes any sense other than in that context. Or it's just an incredible coincidence that these people were in exile and they also had a king that was thrown off down the river, picked up by someone else in the Mesopotamian account in King Sargon of Akkad's accounts, pick up by Aki the irrigator who picked him up, and then he got looked after and he becomes this kind of leader person. It's basically that's the Moses story. So yeah. And the Moses story came second. So there you go. I really appreciate this, Chris. Thank you. I really like you guys. It's very kind, Chris. I think I like you too, and I'm only saying that because I like people who like me. But that's very egocentric. So I thank you anyway, or something. Appreciate that. So any other questions, particularly about the nativity? That'd be fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to say before the end? I know I've already asked you that, but anything about the nativity, anything about the Star of Bethlehem, anything you think you've missed out on saying about the whole thing that we've been talking about?
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of going over the historical critical analysis of these stories. And if you haven't already, there's a book or two that you should be getting. And it should be two, if not three. There's this one by this guy by the name of Jonathan Pearce.
Jonathan MS, multiple sclerosis, some people say. So I've got MS. I do have multiple sclerosis, but right. That's not what. It's just like it's nominative determinism. That so yeah, just
exactly. It's exactly the same way. Like when I have a kid, I'm going to name them Jeeves just because I want them to be a butler.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, do it.
But like I said, I think we've hit the historical critical things. And when it comes to my own explorations, my current projects are related to the greater reception history of these stories. So I've been digging into how ancient, medieval, and modern people have been interpreting these stories and looking for historical trends there, especially the efforts to try to avoid the obvious miraculousness of the stories. And yet every Christmas at the planetarium, you'll find someplace saying, oh yeah, it could be understood by these motions of the planets. It's like, why is that story being told, even though biblical scholars already by the end of the 19th century were just like, yeah, this ain't it, chief. Why is that happening? That's something I've been exploring.
You used to do that. You worked, didn't you, in one of those planetariums doing that? So
yeah, that's how I first learned about this. And when I first learned about it, it also fit in with my own theology at the time, because at that time I called myself, or would have considered myself, a Catholic deist. God set up the laws of the universe, and a perfect God creates a perfect universe that doesn't require tinkering. Yeah. So seeing the gears of the universe generate results like that was like, all right, that's exactly what God should do. But then I found out, oh, there are other hypotheses. Oh, no Bible scholar actually believes this. Oh, I learned Greek. Oh, the people talking about this don't know one thing or the other about Greek. Like literally can't tell the difference between nouns and verbs, and yet are going to tell me what the words actually mean? No. There's a reason I had to write a book or a few about this subject. And I'm also currently in the process of publishing some other papers related to what I think might be additional mythological background to the Star of Bethlehem story, but that is yet to go through the peer review process and convincing other scholars that I'm either completely crazy or only 50% crazy about what I'm going to propose.
Yeah, well, I'd say it's the former. But good luck with that. No, that's fantastic. And of course, we've got a book coming out at some time soon. It's just going through the last bits of proof editing. So our book is Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide. And I'm dead excited about that. I think it's a pretty decent book, if I do say so myself, talking about how the impact of aliens, the discovery of an intelligent alien life, how that might affect religious belief and theology. Do you want to say something about that quickly?
Yeah. So as we've been promoting several times, that we have found that the current Christian philosopher attempt to say that there is not an issue between the discovery of extraterrestrials and the Catholic faith or Christian faith generally is not well supported. And especially when we go into the history of these ideas, we find that this has historically been a problem within Christianity and will almost certainly continue to be a problem. And if one of these days in my lifetime that we actually finally discover that we are not alone in the universe, this is going to cause a lot of cognitive dissonance for both the layperson and for the elite thinkers about the world's major religions.
Yeah, it's just really interesting to think that, if all intelligent alien life out there, and there's potentially infinite numbers of, it depends how big you think the universe is really, if there, or is there just a large amount of intelligent alien life forms out there, then if they're all moral creatures, then are they all fallen like we are? We assume they are, otherwise it's unfair on us. And if they are all fallen, how do they get, how do they get salvation? And if it's the incarnation of God in whatever form it might be, and if that's the best way of doing it, then you assume everyone gets a chance to have the best way, in which case you might have this scenario where you've got literally trillions of Jesuses existing around the universe, and perhaps many of those at the same time existing simultaneously, in order to give each of these instances of intelligent life salvation. And you think that's weird. It's just a very weird concept, and I'm sure it doesn't fit very easily with the biblical idea that we're the special ones. But anyway, that's the sort of stuff we talk about in a book, and we love talking about it, don't we? Just
we will talk about it until the aliens finally come to tell us to shut up.
We've heard it. Shut up. Like, he's not here. Jesus isn't here. His name's Pete. Anyway. Oh damn. Anyway. So whatever. So thank you very much for you guys in the live chat. Thank you for listening, for being part of this. Thanks, Chris, for your donation there. Really appreciate that. Please check out, continue to check out interviews I have here, but check out Aaron's work. Grab yourself a copy of his book. It really is like as Richard Carrier said, it's the go-to book on the Star of Bethlehem. But it's not just about, you don't have to be like a super obsessed person about the Star of Bethlehem. There's so much other stuff in this book. It touches on so many other elements of both the Nativity, but just kind of astronomy in general and astrology even at the time, and these ideas, cultural, historical ideas. But it's just a really interesting book. Go and get it.
Yes, it even has great contact with modern culture. As just a touch of that, I have 2 references to Queen that actually are integral to the understanding of the Magi story. Queen the band.
Yes. What better idea? What better reason can you have to get that book? Anyway, guys, really appreciate that. Aaron, I always love spending time with you. Let's do it again. We'll find out something. We'll make up something to talk about, and we can bang on and just enjoy our Sunday afternoons. Well, at least in my case, Sunday afternoon. Passing the time talking stuff that we love, and hopefully other people do as well. Thank you so much for your time, Aaron. Thanks for everyone else. Toodle pips, and check out for future lives coming your way on A Tippling Philosopher. Last words to Aaron.
Keep watching the skies.
Keep watching the skies. Nice. They weren't the last words of you because I just spoke. Anyway, bye.